This week we will be discussing appraising qualitative designs and approaches. In your textbook, this is chapters 10 and 11. Qualitative research is different from quantitative research. And one of the beauties of it is that while you create your research design in advance, the research design can be adjusted as you collect data. When we talk about the characteristics of qualitative research design, the first thing we do is we consider it emergent. And this means that it evolves as we collect data and make decisions. The flexibility of qualitative research is one of its advantages. We also know that it benefits from ongoing data analysis. We don't have to wait until all data is in to do analysis. In fact, we do analysis as we go. And by doing that, if adjustments are needed, those adjustments can be made. And it often involves triangulation of various data sources. Finally, one of the reasons that many nurse researchers like qualitative research is that it is a holistic approach that's aimed to understand the whole. And for us, that's frequently the whole person that is the patient for which we are providing care. We consider nursing holistic. It's not surprising then that we want to do holistic research. The researchers also become intensely involved in their research and reflective. This is a wonderful advantage, but this can also be very time-consuming for the person doing the research. Some of the qualitative design features are that it is considered non-experimental. Non-experimental, an easy way to understand it, is that it usually will not have an independent and a dependent variable, and it probably is not going to have a control group. Rarely are the studies blinded, and this is intentional because you want to attempt to have a rich and in-depth understanding of the phenomena you are studying. We generally do not compare groups. So there's not an intervention group and a control group. It usually occurs in a naturalistic setting. And again, this is one of the reasons so many nurses like qualitative research, because the care we provide happens in that naturalistic setting. It's not the controlled environment of a lab. It can be cross-sectional, meaning we have one data point, or it can be longitudinal with multiple data points. There is some disagreement about whether you can get causality from qualitative research. Qualitative research, as you probably remember from chapter 1, is fairly low on the evidence hierarchy. I provided you this graphic on the evidence hierarchy, and it is a comparative grid of the 7 levels of evidence. And you will notice that the quality of evidence goes from the bottom to the top, with systematic reviews or meta-analysis being at the top, and things like expert opinion, case control studies, and cohort studies being lower on that level. What is clear is that the information from qualitative studies is considered lower on this evidence level. But there is disagreement about whether it's appropriate for assessment of causal relationships. And you can read in your text that there is an extensive amount of disagreement on this. We know that Lincoln and Gruba wrote an entire chapter in a book on this issue, and they actually preferred the term mutual shaping. And one of the reasons when we're looking at qualitative research is we kind of resist somewhat the causality is we believe that all factors play together. So it may be that the factors are interacting, but it may not be that they are causal. Qualitative research has multiple traditions, and throughout the semester we cover some of these, but let's go through a few right now. There is ethnography, phenomenology, grounded theory, case studies, narrative analysis, descriptive qualitative studies, and then we can talk about research with ideological perspectives such as critical theory, feminist research, and participatory action research. Let me cover just a few of these. Ethnography describes and interprets a culture and cultural behavior. The culture is the way a group of people live. It's about their pattern of activity and the structures that are symbolic within that culture. It includes their values and their norms that give their activities significance to them. It does rely on extensive field work. So if you're going to do ethnographic research, then you're going to have a lot of field work. We know that culture is inferred from the group's words, their actions, and the products of their members, and that it assumes that culture guides the way people structure their experiences. It also, for the researcher, involves participant observation, and this is a really important source of information to us. It's important because it does provide us a very holistic view in a very natural setting. Another approach is phenomenology, and it focuses on the description and interpretation of people's lived experiences. Some of the things we may want to do is ask about the essence of a phenomenon as it's experienced by the person or the group in which we are doing the research and what that means. It acknowledges that people are part of the world in which they live. Grounded theory focuses on discovery of basic social, psychological problems that of a defined group of people and their experiences. It has a number of theological roots, including symbolic interaction. And its primary data comes from in-depth interviews, usually with about 20 to 30 people. And it may be supplemented by observations and written documents. Often, the written documents are the researcher's field notes that they are taking. So let's skip down and let's talk about some of the research with ideological perspectives. Critical theory is concerned with a critique of existing social structures and with envisioning new possibilities. If we think of critical ethnography, then we are focusing on raising consciousness in the hope of affecting social change. And it is one of the areas that you've probably heard a lot about lately, talking about critical race theory. Feminist research focuses on how gender domination and discrimination shapes women's lives and their consciousness. And finally, participatory action research produces knowledge through close collaboration with groups or communities that are vulnerable to control or oppression. And it gives the groups an active role in the research, from the design to the analysis. One thing that is sometimes helpful is to look at a comparison of data collections. And I provided you this table from your textbook 11.1. And you will notice that it lines up ethnography, phenomenology, and grounded theory. And it gives you examples of the types of data that's collected, the unit of data collection points, the length of time for data collection, data recording, and salient field issues. If you read through this carefully, you will notice that some of it's fairly simple and similar, the type of data. It's primarily observations and interviews. And you will notice in-depth interviews, sometimes diary, written materials, and in grounded theory, primarily individual interviews, sometimes group interviews, observation diaries, and documents. That's fairly similar. The unit of data collection is a little different. For ethnography, it's cultural systems. And for phenomenology and grounded theory, it's the individuals. And then the collection points also differ a little. For grounded theory and ethnography, it can be cross-sectional or longitudinal. And for phenomenology, it's mainly cross-sectional. You can look through this and see that one of the other big important differences is ethnography has field notes and logs. And in ethnography, those field notes and logs are very important. I think that this table is helpful, and if you keep the table with you when you're appraising your research, it will be helpful. There is also, in your textbook, Box 10.1, Guidelines for Critically Appraising Qualitative Design. When you're reviewing your articles, I highly suggest that you keep this table and the next table I'm going to show you with you. You want to be able to answer the questions. Was the research tradition for qualitative study identified? If none was identified, can one be inferred? And this is to say, did they say it was ethnographic research or phenomenological or grounded theory? If they didn't say, is it obvious from what you're reading? Is the research question congruent with the specific research tradition? And are the data sources and research methods congruent with that tradition? This is why on the previous slide, I said you also need to keep that with you when you're reviewing your articles. How well was the research design described? Are the design decisions explained and justified, and does it appear that the design emerged during data collection, allowing researchers to capitalize on early information? Remember, we just said that one of the advantages of qualitative research is that while you start out with the design, based on the analysis and data you're collecting, you may be able to adjust that design. Did the design lend itself to a thorough, in-depth examination of the focal phenomenon? In other words, did it work for what you really wanted to know? And was there evidence of reflexivity? Was the design what design elements might have strengthened the study? And one of the examples given here is a longitudinal perspective rather than a cross-sectional one. Obviously, that might impact your design. And finally, was the study undertaken with an ideological perspective? You need to know this. If so, is there evidence that ideological goals were achieved? Was there full collaboration between the researchers and the participants? And did the research have the power to transform? And finally, if you look at box 11.2, it gives you guidelines for critically appraising data collection methods in qualitative studies. Before, you were looking at the overall article. Now you're just looking at the data collection methods. Knowing what the research question was and the characteristics of the study participants, did the researcher use best methods of capturing or studying the phenomenon? So, did they use self-reports? Did they use observations? Did they use interviews? Is there anything that they could have used in addition to what they did use that might have enhanced their studies? If self-report methods were used, did the researcher make good decisions about the specific method used to solicit information? Were they unstructured interviews? Were they semi-structured interviews? Were they focus group interviews? And it matters. What you get out of an individual interview is going to be different than what you get from a group. Remember, in groups, people feed off of each other, and they may remember things they want to add that they didn't think of saying in an individual interview. You want to know if the interviews were recorded and transcribed. Most interviews now do record their interviews, and they have them transcribed. If they were not interviewed, what steps were taken to make sure the data collection was accurate? And sometimes, if you're only taking notes, the person doing the interview may take some notes, but usually there's somebody else present that is also taking notes to make sure that they are equivalent. What role did the researcher assume in terms of being an observer or a participant? And was the role appropriate? Just as in the example I just gave, sometimes the researcher will be taking notes themselves. Sometimes they will have somebody else doing it. But also, what role did they play in the group dynamics? And then finally, how were observational data recorded? Did the recording mechanism maximize data quality? And usually, one of the things that you have in advance is an idea of how you're going to collect your observational data and how you are going to code that data. We'll talk more about coding later. This is just a brief overview of your 2 chapters. I hope you'll take time to read them carefully and keep your textbook with you when you're reviewing articles.